Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Breaking Point Podcast UK. Today, we're here with Vanessa Morgan. Vanessa is a relationship coach, among other things, I'm sure. And we're going to talk about, well, hopefully, we're going to talk about all sorts of things, but we're going to talk about what she's up to, what she's interested in, and yes, just see where we can go with the conversation. How are you doing today, Vanessa? Are you all good?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you.
Good, good, good. So, Um, is Vanessa? Is that all right, or do you want to be? Do you prefer to be called something else? Ness.
Oh,
Is Vin?
no, you can call me Vanessa. I'd love to be called Dr. Vanessa, but I don't actually have my doctorate, so that would be unethical.
Yes,
Maybe one day. No, I'm just kidding. Call me Vanessa. That's perfectly fine.
I'm sure. Or you should. Are you in the process of doing it, or are you thinking about doing it?
No, I went. I got my master's, which is what you need to kind of practice here. And if you want to do research, you really want to kind of like it's like it would be like a next step, but not necessary. So maybe one day when my kids are older.
Yeah, that would be good. Research, because you can do what have you got in psychology? Research, and then well, I suppose there's clinical psychology, isn't
Teaching.
there? Teaching, yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Therapy stuff. So, Vanessa, tell people why you got into relationship.
Why
Not your
why I got into relationship psychology?
Yeah, it's relationship psychology. Yeah, yeah. That's what I meant.
Yeah. It kind of just naturally unfolded. I think lots of people who are attracted kind of to the healing arts and to being therapists kind of have their own. I mean, I think everyone probably has their stuff to work through, right?
Mhm.
But particularly in the family systems of people who are therapists, oftentimes there are family dynamics that kind of put them in this role of caretaker or wanting to be or feeling comfortable sitting in a room listening to people talk about their problems all day, right? Like that's not necessarily everyone's general disposition. So in my family system growing up, my parents had what would be considered a pretty normative, but also kind of dysfunctional relationship.
Mhm.
And I've always been kind of deeply inquisitive. And so, kind of the combination of those two things just started me on this natural trajectory of exploring relationships and how they kind of impact every facet of our life.
Yeah,
So, yeah, it was just kind of a natural process of me being curious and then going to school for it and keep pulling and following threads.
absolutely. Yeah, and the great thing about sort of modern day therapies nowadays is, or being a sort of modern day coach slash therapist, etc., is you can incorporate all sorts of different aspects of fields of psychology and philosophy and etc., etc. So that's really good. When you say So are you kind of like the peacemaker in the household? Is that kind of what you're implying there?
Yes,
Yeah.
um, that there was a way, yeah. And I was an only child, and so specifically for only children, I think you can kind of get pushed into an adult role,
Yes,
and
definitely.
um, so that was at least part of my journey. But I kind of always feel like I've been destined to be a therapist, anyways. Like it's just, I find it very interesting. I never could do a career that I don't feel passionately about.
Yeah,
And
I agree.
it's a challenging career in that like I can never feel like I have all the answers. All I can do is
Mm,
just try to ask the right questions and figure out maybe what the next step is.
mm.
Um, but it's a career that I feel like I have to have so much humility in to do it well. That we'll never know everything about humans. They're infinitely complex, but we should still try to learn as much as we can in our lives.
Absolutely. And also dating is, well, I suppose everything is to some degree, but dating is one of those things that shifts as the culture around it shifts. So there's always it's not an exact science of you can master the science of dating. It's always going to change as time progresses and as things move on. So, talk about what is your sort of therapeutic or philosophical sort of uh, process when it comes to working with people that come to speak to you. Do you have like a philosophy amalgamation of things?
Yeah, I would say that's evolving, and it kind of depends on what the presenting issues are that the clients come to me with. So mostly I see couples.
Hmm.
And mostly that's still informed by what is best practice in the research, which is looking at neurobiology, kind of the parts of the brain that we're using in relationships, whether they're the fast reptilian brain, the fight or flight brain. Those are not relational parts of our brain, but the prefrontal cortex, the thinking parts of the brain, those can be very relational. So looking at that, looking at attachment history, so how people bond to their caregivers growing up, and how that kind of sets the neural patterning and informs the trajectory of bonding throughout the lifespan. So looking at those two things, and then I mean, I'm a spiritual person. I've had a spiritual and meditation practice for like the last 20 years, so for a long time. And so the clients who find me, that also resonates with them, and sometimes because of the things that I post or just people that I know, those generally tend to be the kind of clients that find me. I also like to take what's called a soul-centered approach to relationships, which is viewing people as souls having a human experience, and they're here in earth school to learn certain lessons, certain things, gain virtues, and looking at that through the lens of relationships, that relationships can either kind of perpetuate our trauma, our karma, kind of like keep us dark and oppressed energy, or it can help heal us. And they're equally powerful opportunities that, unless we're conscious in a relationship, like we're really thinking about how we're showing up, who we're participating in relationships with in our life, that there's a general disposition to repeat patterns unconsciously, and those are often traumatic patterns.
Yes, the roots of our behavior tend to, they go incredibly deep into our psyche, don't they? And negative experiences, probably more than positive ones, unfortunately, influence those roots the most, which is a bit annoying but necessary. So,
Annoying to say the least. Yes.
yeah, annoying to say the least. Yeah, definitely. Oh, wow. So, what sort of things do couples come to you about? Can you name a couple of broad sort of topics, patterns that you've seen crop up in recent, however long?
Yeah. So it's almost always the presenting issue is almost always communication, that there's some
Hmm.
breakdown in communication. Communication is very symbolic. Oftentimes there's one person who really wants to kind of talk things out a lot, and one person who does not. Um, Sometimes that plays out by gender. Like if I had to break it down that way, I would say women generally fall in the sphere of group of people who want to talk things out, but not always.
No,
And that men can be a little bit more disconnected from their feelings based on how we've, socialized both genders. But again, like, people are so complex that you can't say one thing that's true about everyone. So I want to be really kind of cautious by making these broad sweeping
of course,
statements.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I would say generally issues in communication, people either tend to get really dysregulated, meaning they get very upset and cannot stay in that nice prefrontal cortex part of their brain where they're actually being very intentional and conscious about the way that they're communicating. And they tend to default to that unconscious reptilian fight or flight one person system where they're only thinking about themselves and self preservation. They're not able to kind of hold their needs simultaneously with their partner's needs. And so almost always there's some kind of breakdown in that kind of system.
And would you say that quite often the communicators tend to find the non-communicators and create all sorts of trouble? I suppose you would do, couldn't you? I suppose in theory you would say that because that's what you're seeing. But I was just wondering if that tends to happen a lot. The people that are great at communicating find people that aren't very good at communicating. I
Well,
wonder if that
I
happens a
wouldn't
lot.
put it like that. I would say that people, like, mental health is generally on a spectrum,
Hmm.
balance is in the middle, even if we're looking at attachment, right? Like avoidant attachment and then anxious attachment. I would break it down more like that people who are anxiously
Okay.
attached aren't necessarily better at communication, but they seek proximity, they seek working it out, they seek connection. And then people who are avoidant and kind of more distancing often pair with these people because what they're needing is to both of them to come more in the middle. That there's times that it's
Mm.
really healthy to be connected and share things, and then there's times when it's like, no, you need to work that through on your own before you bring it to your partner and process it a bit more. And so oftentimes, because these people are polarized in their skill sets or their worldviews, they find each other because they're unconsciously needing some kind of corrective balance.
Yes, they're being unconsciously pulled towards the other half so that they can create they can integrate each other, integrate the what Jung would call, I think, the maybe the lesser sort of states of, because what I'm not sure what they are. There's thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition or something. I've gone off on a tangent, I think, but I think there's some sort of link between what you just said to that, the sense of the polarities are seeking each other out, and part of the unconscious is looking for that rectification, but it's about facilitating that process, which is obviously what you're trying to do with people. Good.
Yes. Yeah. Slow it down. Make it more conscious.
Yes. So you're Vanessa. You're clearly a very, very intelligent. I'm very impressed. Not impressed, but that sounds patronizing. But you've spoken really, really well so far. So why didn't?
Thank
What's your history? Because you could definitely have gone on to. You could definitely have been like a very good. I mean, I'm sure you are a very good therapist, but you could have. You could have your doctorate by now. You're definitely intelligent enough. So what is, talking about you, what is your history and where did you get to where? I know we've kind of done it, but go into a little bit more detail if you want to. You don't have to. Of
you.
where you are now with, you said you've got children, so that's always a good
Yeah.
thing.
Yes. So I've been married 2 times. My first husband, currently married to my second husband. The first marriage was largely unconscious. So all the unconscious material, wounded stuff from my childhood kind of had me pair bond with someone who was equally wounded in his own way. And we um, could not make that marriage work. And I saw how hard that was so he's the father of my children. And
Hmm.
it was so hard, so much painful learning. On one hand, I'm really grateful for the learning, right? That like I could not be who I am today if I stayed in that marriage.
Yeah.
And I've used all that painful learning to kind of help me um, use it as a catalyst for understanding a bigger picture in suffering in relationships. So while it was a very painful process to go through what I went through, and that was about 10 years ago when I initiated the divorce, almost exactly, actually. Um, and the kids were just really little at the time. So I started that relationship before I was in school, and kind of through the process of being in graduate school, understanding attachment, I kind of had this awakening
Mm.
um, that like, oh, this isn't healthy. And sometimes partners can learn the skills that they need to be healthy together. And sometimes the trauma is just kind of too great on one or both sides and they have to separate. And so in my case, we had to separate. And so that's a big thing that kind of informs also how I've looked at relationships. I've had to learn a lot about
Yes.
attachment to look at mine and what kind of had me, unconsciously seeking out partners that weren't treating me well.
Mm.
To get to where I am today, to I feel good, in the relationship that I'm in now, and it's been a long journey. And I can't even say that
Yeah.
we're all the way there. Like my husband, and when I met him, he does his own therapy. I did mine. We occasionally go to couples therapy, so we're doing all our own work, but it's still just so hard, Like there's still these moments where we're like, "Oh my goodness!" And I kind of have this budding theory, and it's not official, But I kind of wonder, like, if men or women were ever meant to spend this much time together. Like, if we're more meant to spend time with our own kind of like gender and then come together for some like really great sex and raise babies and then go off and hang out with our friends again, you know? Like, I think there's something about the pressure of living with one person who's not the same as you that's just really freaking hard, you know? And so we're here for it and we're trying, but it's like, wow, like there is something in relationships and the way that we're doing them in our modern culture that feels deeply kind of like, I don't want to say broken because that sounds so negative, but that we're in need of some evolution, like now. And we're facing a lot of bifurcation. There's a gender war is happening, and like so many things that are just dividing us, whether it's politically, like just there's so much division, this camp and this camp. And I think that's just a really hard way to do humans, like to do life, is we need to figure out like what our common ground is instead of what separates us. And
Mm.
and that takes a lot of conscious awareness.
It does. I like that was a very good little speech. Yes, I think there's. I mean, we forget that there was a book published in 1992, I think, called "Men Are From." Everyone's heard of it, but "Men Are From Mars and Women Are From
Mm,
Venus," and sort of ironically, 30 years later, we've reached a point where some people think that there's no that because you've spoken about socialization, but then what you've just said does not go with socialization. So we'll get into that. But the point, what I was saying is, and some people think that men and women are exactly the same, and I actually think both of those things are true. I think it's another one of those uh, paradoxical phenomenons where this is pretty much the entirety of life. Two completely differing statements or opposing statements can be simultaneously true. And I think you're right, and I like the idea. I would say that all that pressure that maybe you're feeling is pressure makes diamonds, isn't it? And maybe life is actually better when there's a grappling. Apparently, I heard this a few, whatever, doesn't matter. But Eve, as in Adam and Eve, the name Eve means ideal adversary or something like that. So
mm,
that's kind of another thing that the Adam and Eve story is trying to say. It's that as you say, we do kind of have this conception that utopia would be when life is perfect and there are no issues and everything's sorted. But actually, that isn't what utopia really would look like, because that would eventually become. I was speaking earlier today on another podcast. We were talking about chaos and order, or masculine and feminine is
mm,
another way of putting it. Too much of the same thing, no matter how good, will fundamentally become a bad thing eventually, because you'll just get bored. And so that when you just use the word pressure, I think maybe, as much as it may be annoying at times, maybe that is a necessary, not necessary evil, that's too dark, but a necessary uh, compromise to have that difficulty in order for something greater to be born. Do you sort of get what I said there?
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I do think it's paradoxical. I don't know the answer because I think it's both, like you said, both things are true, that like
Yes.
perhaps we are culturally, we've split men and women off into two separate of a category,
Hmm.
like there, and that there's so much more overlap than we have ever thought before.
Yes.
Um, but then also that maybe there are some differences that need to be
Hmm.
honored, and just this blanket model of like completely deconstructing gender where there's no difference is too far, because we do have physiological differences at the very least, right? So it's like
Yes.
um it's very complex, and in academia I will say is a big pressure right now to not name any differences, right? That when we're writing academically, the pressure is to say partner A, partner B, and
Mm-hmm.
I've certain got gotten a lot of heat writing about men's issues or women's issues. And partly that's because I haven't sorted through all my stuff. So of course I'm going to have some biases that people see and can call me on, and I'm welcome to grow
Hmm.
from it. Um, but I it is just so complex, and I'm just so glad to be having these kinds of conversations, because I don't know, many of us don't know, but
Yeah,
I think what the
exactly.
best that we can do right now is begin to wonder together about what actually feels good within a couple, right? And
Yeah,
instead of just assuming or having these like external things be imposed upon us by society, or whatever that great force is that people
yeah.
can two people can have the autonomous power to think between them how they'd like to be seen by the other person, and that can be like so healing.
When I interview women and I ask about their past, it's kind of, I wait for the moment that they say, I was in a toxic relationship, or I was with someone that it's kind of like it's like clockwork now. And you've obviously, you know, you have also been in that position. What do you think draws women to those? I mean, I've got loads of ideas, but what do you think it is? And then they retrospectively go and try to put the emphasis on the women, not on the men, in terms
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
what it is.
So
Yeah,
I think that women are socialized not to be really good at boundaries, to be um, kind of caretaking, but in a way that's pathological. Like I think it is changing. So I will just speak for my generation. I'm an elder millennial, and I would say that the women in my cohort kind of um, were really permissive of behavior that wasn't okay. It was kind of abusive and didn't know how to have boundaries around that. And a lot of women think like, oh, if I just can control this person or I can change them and make them be who I need them to be, rather than looking at the parts in ourselves that need healing before we're even ready to come to relationship. That was,
yeah,
that's what happened in my case, is that it's just, they like, there's this idea that the nervous system kind of houses your identity. So you're just kind of going about life doing what feels familiar. So, I almost think like the female collective, or, the feminine collective and the masculine collective have different things that they're working through. Like men have historically gone to war and, had to face all of those kinds of atrocities, right? Women have been abandoned in that, right? Have a big abandonment wound, being left on their own to do things. And so we've kind of got different things as women that we need to work through, I think, collectively. And again, this is just an idea that's forming. It's not fully formed. I could be saying all sorts of things,
yeah,
rooted
yeah.
in
That's
my
good.
own
I do that
ignorance.
all the
So
time.
yeah, I'm
Allow it.
not married to this idea, but if I'm just wondering out loud with you, it just, for me, it even like our TV shows, like what we're socialized to value, just have nothing to do with what's healthy in a
Yeah,
relationship.
and
It's the skills that you need.
there's there's definitely a sort of transgenerational trauma going on, and hopefully that will go in. But I would say that it's not. You said sort of, Gen millennial. It's not a millennial thing. It's a very much a Gen Z thing as well. It's the is what you've just sort of, the phrase you use, thinking they can change them, is the archetypal feminine story of the feminine believes that it can control the wayward and chaotic, ironically, chaotic masculine, which is why feminism is fundamentally, not fundamentally, but in large part become a movement against the patriarchy. It's the exact same thing, just playing out in a political sphere as opposed to an energetic sphere. And it's it's Beauty and the Beast. It's all these romance novels. They all sort of, they tell the exact same narrative, which is innocent woman attempts to tame wild man, and in turn creates a solid relationship. And I don't know. I definitely think there is a sense of sort of trauma experience, and in my experience, when a woman has had a particularly bad experience with men or with her dad, she tends to go one of two ways, which is one, she learns from it and picks probably the sort of guy that you're going out with at the moment or you're married to at the moment, or she doubles down and she goes for someone who's really, really, really bad news and then ends up in all sorts of trouble. And I suppose how maybe that's just a lesson that young women need to go through. And I don't know, because it's causing a lot of issues in the sort of dating market at the moment. That kind of, because women are getting a bad rap because men say, "Oh, they only like arseholes," and it's not quite simple as that. It's far more nuanced. And women are getting bad rap because they keep getting upset and end up single. And but it is a complicated thing. And I was thinking about this the other day. What sort of marriage and no sex before marriage and early marriage did is that it limited the pathological aspects of male sexuality and female sexuality. I think it was a way of mitigating things from going wrong, society and individually. So it stopped men from, obviously they still did, but what tends to happen is a small minority of men get access to the majority of the women, and the majority of men get access to no women. And then so it stops the majority of men from just, you know, running through, to use a crude term, and then it stops the minority of men from being completely on their own. And then on the female side, obviously this is all heterosexual, and then on the female side, it stops women from feeling misused and being treated in a way that is effectively just like a pawn. And then they become, because I think a lot of the hatred and the vitriol against men and the patriarchy from women is a projection of their own difficulties that they've had with men. And it's a whole big mess. And it's a perfect example of how you think you can sort out a problem, but actually you can sort out some of the problem, but you in turn create a bigger problem or create new problems as a result.
I think it's the consciousness with which you approach solving that problem. So if you're trying to meet it
Yeah.
at the same fear-based level, it's going to create
Mm.
more of the same shadow. If you try to kind of think of it from multiple angles, not just one right angle, you must share my worldview, right? But we can kind of have a more receptive, curious stance, men and women, all gendered people. Just like,
Yeah.
really, what is going on? How can we be more intentional? What are the needs? This is what I've learned from all my years of couples therapy, right? Is that we can get in these stalemates and power struggles over like, you must meet my need. You
Yeah.
owe me. And it's this entitled, angry, controlling energy. And that's not the way through to something new, a different paradigm. A different paradigm will be ushered in by compassionate curiosity. And that's at least so far what I know, right? Not by forcing and oppressing like in a different way. Um,
Very good. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, that's what I think. That's what I know so far, anyway, that there's something, that constriction that I can feel kind of like, I would say that women are really hungry for men to kind of slow down and think about, like, oh, yeah, women are, when men do care that that woman's probably doing so out of trauma, right? Probably doing so out of really like not um, being socialized in a way that gives her a lot of other value or much options. And I think that
Yeah.
men are hungry for women to hear like how they're suffering as well, right? That we no person can have a monopoly and their pain necessarily trump somebody else's, that we kind of have to unite together and just think about what we want the future to look like, rather than just this. It's the same thing in politics, right? For just right and left, there's this whole group of people in the
Exactly.
middle that could be so powerful
Mm.
together if we could just stop focusing on the things that we think the other people are wrong about.
Yeah, no, I don't want to cut out the conversation, so I'm just going to say PRN. But you're absolutely right. I mean, what an absolute disaster that has been. Uh, is another example of how the idea that everything is trivial and there's no deeper meaning behind anything has been incredibly dangerous and corrosive, because fundamentally PORN is has no positives really, other than I guess the obvious, which yeah, basically it's awful for men and it's awful for their perceptions, and yeah, but you're right. What else did you say? There was a lot you just said. What did you
Well, I
say?
think speaking of that
Um,
though, that like it becomes a very dopamine driven endeavor and it's corrupted. Like sexuality can be sacred, right? But that's not at all how we hold it in our culture.
I
Or at
agree.
least not how most people do. And so I think that energy that's so powerful has been corrupted by some darkness,
Yeah,
by
it has.
some power
It
over
has.
thinking.
Yeah, it's pleasure. It's Pleasure Island. In the Pinocchio, you should watch Pinocchio. It's the sort of thing you'd be interested, based on the way you're talking. In Pinocchio, there's the what's he called? The coachman tries to lure these young boys to Pleasure Island, and what he does so to turn them into uh, donkeys, and then to sell them to the salt mine, and that's kind of what porn is to some degree, in video games and stuff like that. It's
Mm-hmm.
Pleasure Island, and but you're selling your soul. Maybe not so with video games. And I get people are going, "Oh, you're being too deep, mate." If you think that, fair enough. I don't really think so, but all right. Uh, and that's kind of, beware of Pleasure Island and what lures you there, because things are not often not what they seem, and yeah, it's damaging in all fronts, and it's so complicated because we can retroactively look back and pick out all the problems with the past, but we can't seem to really do that in the present very well. So we have this societal cycle of, oh, that was wrong back then, this is good now, and then in 50 years time or whenever, I hope they'll look and they'll say, yeah, dating apps, PORN, all that shit was really damaging. I mean, not
Mm.
good fundamentally. I hope so. Do you get people, uh, clients coming to you going, I'm worried that he's texting other girls, or she's texting other guys, or he's spending too much time on his phone? Uh, is has that Does that crop up in your
Oh yeah.
conversations? Oh yeah.
Yes, 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 yes. People have all sorts of ways of kind of filling that void in the relationship when they're not feeling connected, when they don't have intimacy between the two of them, when they don't know how to even articulate and share their
Mm,
authentic perspectives, right? They can't have intimacy. And so people supplement with sex, drugs, food, like all sorts of dopamine rich
mm,
activities.
mm.
It's not the same though.
Yeah.
It's not the same as real connection with another human.
No, it's not. No, it's a f- it's a poor substitute, isn't it? It's like yeah, there's the Peter Pan. People often the one of the interpretations of what the Peter Pan story is about is it's about the boy, or the man who never grows up. So he's kind of like a man child in a sense. That's kind of what he is. He lives in Neverland, which doesn't exist. He's got Tinkerbell, which is like this, as you said, fake girlfriend, sort of porn esque AI, whatever you want to say. And he just floats around, and he could have a relationship with Wendy, the girl. This is really random, but just when you brought that up, I thought, just a little tangent, he could have a relationship with Wendy, but he doesn't. Captain Hook is a metaphor for the age, how we age, and how he's got a part of him already. The crocodile, I think the crocodile's got a clock in his stomach or something, and it's
Uh-huh.
like this is what this is. Peter Pan doesn't want to grow up to be Captain Hook, so he stays young. But as a man, if you stay young, you things you become an adult infant, and that can be even worse than the thing that you're worried about. And women won't respect you if you're an adult infant most of the time. Occasionally they might do, but and they want someone who's capable and ambitious. Fair enough to them. Absolutely, that's a woman's right, is to be judgy. They can be judgy. That's another thing I wanted to talk about. I suppose it's probably not quite relevant because you have couples coming to you, but do you ever work with single people?
Yeah, I do. People, it's like all relationship stuff. So people who want to be in a
Okay.
relationship and can't seem to, find one that works for them, or they keep attracting the same kind of partners, that aren't emotionally available.
Mm.
So kind of the scope of in which I work is just relationship. Um, what was the question though? I kind of forgot.
Do you work with single people? It's not really a very good
Oh
question, to be
yes.
fair. It's not very
No,
specific.
I do. Oh, I think you said
Um,
something about just like judgy discernment. Like, yes, you want discernment, and
oh
I
yes,
think that I
discernment.
don't want
Yeah.
to conflate women's desire to feel safe and secure, like everyone's desire to feel safe and secure,
Yeah.
with these external attributes like money or height. That like safety is an internal process and an external process, but you have to kind of apply discernment and know yourself really well. So when people don't have good attunement in childhood. Like their caregivers couldn't really see them. They weren't very emotionally available, which is what happened in my childhood, right? That both my
Hmm.
parents had their own kind of attachment trauma. And so, because of that, I just did what other people with attachment trauma do, which is go out and seek relationships that are mirroring that internal trauma that I have.
Mm.
And so, until I learned how to, I mean, I have done so much healing. I've done every kind of healing from working with a shaman to Reiki energy healing, something called theta healing, a traditional psychotherapy, parts work. I mean, I am just kind of like a seeker. I want to know what it takes to really like heal. And what I've come to so far is that it's not just one thing, but it's kind of like all these interrelated things, how we're eating. It's the energy with which we do anything is what gives us the capacity to transcend or transmute these unconscious or dark energies within relationship that keep us kind of stuck in trauma or perpetuating cycles that are harmful to those around us and
Oh,
in the relationship.
and those are right. Say that. What did you say that bit again? You said the energy that we do anything is how we do everything. Did you say something like that? You
I
can't remember,
didn't
can you?
say that, but I do think that that's probably one of those paradoxical truisms that like you could find things that like they say that about money or how you eat, like that there's patterning that we bring to many domains of our life that mirror each thing.
Do you want to hear my theories on why young women stereotypically find men with dark triad uh, traits attractive? I've got a few different theories, and as we've already spoken about before, they completely contradict one another, but I still think there's some truth to them. So I've got to think now because I had this, and what are they? So the first one I think is there's a sense of adventure to it. I think there's a sense, as you already said, the sense of controlling, in the same way that the masculine myth or the masculine hero's myth is to go out into the unknown, to go out into chaos and transmute chaos into order. I think the feminine myth is the same thing, but a slightly different form of chaos. So it's to transmute masculine chaos and maybe even corruption, etc., into a more stable and controlled version of its previous self, which I think is kind of makes sense in the sense of it's the polar, it's like the brother or the sister version of the hero's journey. But, and obviously, it's not sex specific, as I said. We're not talking about men and women, we're talking about masculine and feminine. So there's one reason. The other reason, and I think
Should I
I've
talk?
worked
Can
this
I
out.
say something? I'm
Yes,
sorry. I was
yes,
like,
yeah,
wait,
yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
going to be able to think of all the things. Can we talk about the first reason
Yeah, it's a
first,
good point.
or
Yeah.
the first theory
Critique
first?
me.
Okay. So I haven't heard. I've kind of heard more like that the feminine energy carries the archetype of chaos, and the masculine, carries more of like that order,
Yes.
right? And that like
Hmm.
um so I haven't quite heard like the masculine chaos, but so it doesn't mean I'm wrong. You're wrong. I just haven't heard of it. But the one thing that
Hmm.
I think that I heard in there that I want to kind of pull and tease out is that like women are attracted to this bad boy archetype that just doesn't care, like this is kind of like
Yeah.
free,
Fuck you.
just
Apathetic. Yeah, free. Yeah.
free, doesn't care. And I think that might stem from women feeling so oppressed that like oftentimes we sexualize things that we like get in us. Like we want this trait. We want this virtue of like not feeling like we have to care so much. We want that. And so we do that by
Mm,
sexualizing that energy in men, that men, if they can be
mm.
kind of socialized,
Okay.
like, if I show feelings or vulnerability, that's weak. Women are carrying the other half of that, of like all the vulnerability. And so there's some kind of balancing
Yeah.
thing in seeking out
Yeah.
that archetype of the bad boy who just doesn't care at all. We kind of want some
Yeah.
of that. Like not that we want to go abandon our children, but the kind of freedom to feel like, oh, we could do that, like we
Yeah.
haven't been able to have that. That's just even to say that feels so dark, but that's part of my socialization, right? Like, I don't really want to abandon my kids, but I do want some freedom. That sounds amazing.
Yes.
And so I think
Yeah.
sometimes the unconscious, unprocessed shadow of that is that seeking that equality, or that, not even equality, but that getting that construct in us. It's imbalanced, right? It's imbalanced
Mm,
because it's too chaotic because it lacks virtue.
mm.
But there's something there that I would say, at least about your first theory. That's what I really wanted to say about it.
Yes. And response to that, I would say interesting. The socialization interesting. I would say it's also just from a trait psychology perspective, women tend to be higher in negative emotion, neuroticism, and the reason people think that is because they're physically smaller than men. They're um, particularly physically weaker upper body wise, and they have the primary role caregiving for responsible looking after children, at least when they're early. And you could say, well, they don't have the primary, but they do fundamentally rear them inside of them, so that's pretty primary. And the other one is they're more sexually vulnerable as well. So and obviously all that comes under the bracket of the fact that socialization sits on top of all that. But there is unfortunately uh, a possible biological. Well, it's not even possible. Like they know it's well documented in psychology that is one of the differences between men and women. Obviously, there's overlap, and maybe they're wrong, etc., etc. But still, that's what they kind of think, or they have thought recently. But yes, I do like that idea of the freedom, and there's the apathy of just not giving a fuck is a very very powerful tool for anyone to have, and something that a lot of people could do with implementing into their lives a lot more than they currently do.
Yeah, that external validation seeking will kill you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I never thought of it like that. I like that idea. The second theory is that the toxic feminine desires the toxic masculine. So when women are young, they have to, in a sort of Jungian sense, they have to integrate the toxic feminine inside of them. And they possibly do that as a result of an encounter with the toxic masculine, or as a result of exploring their attraction to that, and therefore they then have to learn to incorporate the negative parts of themselves and become a fully fledged individual as they age and mature. And dating someone who is clearly bad news somehow helps them facilitate that process. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So I would say to conceptualize that maybe even a bit further that they're immature feminine traits,
Yeah,
um, catharsis, jealousy. Oh gosh, they're not coming to mind right now. I want to think of them so bad though right now.
envy.
Kind of attention seeking, those kind of things, right? And
Yeah,
then there's immature masculine traits that were kind of like counterbalance them. And then there's mature feminine traits and mature masculine traits. And so the polarity seeks each other out in either one of those frameworks. So if you can be conscious, you can have polarity that seeks each other out in health. But if it's unconscious, it seeks each other out to gain more balance uh, in that something around that, like it's not again not a
yeah, yeah,
fully
yeah,
formed
definitely.
framework. There's people who talk about this much more eloquently than I am right now, but I think you're
No,
on to
no, no.
something. I think that
Very good.
model would be quite helpful, is that like how do we there's something that these two opposing forces, the immature and mature qualities, that we need to learn to work with them more intentionally.
Yes, and I like the term mature actually. The idea of like development and how life you develop through life, and it becomes very beneficial when you reach that point, if you can reach that point, and ideally reach that point with as little pain as possible. Uh, okay, we've had a really fucking deep conversation. I love it. I wasn't expecting this at all. I'll be honest with you. I was expecting. I mean, I was kind of. I thought you were going to sort of not agree with a lot of things I said. So I'm really glad that you have been so open and receptive to what I've been talking about. Has being a parent done to your perception of life? And, there's a lot of talk nowadays about women, you don't need to have kids, it's their hindrance, etc. And what would you say to a young 19-year-old, 18-year-old that who's very adamant that they don't want to have children? What advice would you give them?
Hmm. I mean, I guess it's the context under which they're seeking my advice. Like relationships, between two adults are so evocative. The relationship
Yeah.
that, when you have a child, like it's even, for at least for me, has been this whole other unlayering of my trauma and stuff that I need to work through. Like
Mm.
parenting is such an incredible journey. I would never trade it for anything. It's been one of the biggest. I mean, I love my career, so grateful for my career, but the biggest blessing in my life has been being a parent to these little souls that are my children and my stepchildren. Um, but I don't think that that should ever be imposed on anyone. Like it is so hard. It is so hard, and we are so under supported in parenting and under
Yeah.
resourced that, like, to each their own, like it is. I don't want to make it sound overly terrible, but it is not for, it's the hardest thing I've ever done, but I'm really glad that I'm doing it.
Yeah.
Oh, just to do it well, you have to really be able to look at all your inherent, like how you were parented, how you received love and learned to give love in childhood is your template for parenting too. So if
Mm.
you had parents that didn't see you very well and didn't kind of help you grow these mature qualities, then parenting is going to be very challenging,
Mm.
And so I
Yeah.
would just say, if you don't want to be a parent, look at that. Try to figure out, bring awareness to that, and as long as you go through life really kind of um, being curious and open, I think you're probably more safe than if you feel like you know everything, you know?
Definitely, that is completely true. The more you think you know, the less you actually do. Would you, as much as it's been hard, would you say it's been beyond worth it, and you wouldn't change it for the world?
Oh yeah, I wouldn't change it for the world. I'm really biased though.
Yeah.
I really like my kids. Like I really find them to
No,
be
I think
special
that's.
humans.
I don't know. No, I'm sure they are. That you're their mum, so they will be pretty great. So I think that's absolutely right. I think that's the best way of expressing it. It's that it's going to be hard, but it's going to be worth it as well. And that is that, the cliche of anything worth having is, or whatever it is, anything worth having is hard to achieve, or you know what I'm saying. So I think that is absolutely the case. So good advice. Let's do the final question, because it's getting, you've got things to do. It's called the Breaking Point Podcast because I'm interested in people's breaking points or moments where they thought, I need to make a change. And a lot of people say they've got loads, uh, or some people say they've got none. Some people have one moment that comes to mind straight away. Do you have a moment that, maybe it doesn't have to even be related to relationships or anything? It could be anything, just a moment that sticks in your head where you thought, this is a pretty low moment, or maybe even this is a high moment, uh, but I need to recollect and move forward appropriately. Anything come to mind?
Hmm. That's such a deep question. I mean, kind of is how I've lived my life, with these little mini deaths over and over again, that like,
Yep, ego death. We love them.
yeah, yeah. Breaking points. I mean, also, I feel like I've had many. I've had some low points, in terms of just like, in terms of the divorce, and all that stuff was so
Yes.
incredibly
Yeah.
hard.
Hmm.
But gosh, does anything come to mind? I mean, I've had several moments of just complete paradigm shift where I thought like, oh, this
Mm.
is the answer, and then I'm like, oh no, there's more. So
Mm.
I don't know if there's
There's always
one
more.
moment that comes to mind that's just been my breaking point. But what I will say is that I feel like, kind of in the context of relationships, we are at an inflection point where it is like paramount that, instead of men and women or people against each other, that we really start to look at, what do we have in common? Like, let's drop all the
Mm.
armor when it's safe to, and find the people that we can do that with. And really remember that, like, we need each other. Like, we fundamentally are, humans are wired for connection. And I think in the culture that we grow up in globally, that we kind of tend to objectify each other a bit more than is healthy for us. And so I would, speak not just to my particular breaking points in relationships, but just more a call to action globally, that like, we need to really stop focusing on needing things, and because that's not sustainable, and focusing on that, like, we actually need each other a lot more than we even know, and go about learning the skills that we need to be successful in relationships. Because if we don't, we're just going to keep trying to supplement that in ways that are not healthy for us.
Absolutely. And I love, I mentioned Pinocchio, another Disney film. There's loads of them. The early Disneys were great for representing sort of archetypal stories and stuff. At the end of Snow White, they when the prince kisses Snow White, so that the masculine awakens the feminine, in the same way that in Sleeping Beauty, the feminine awakens the masculine, because the prince has to battle with the evil witch and the dragon in order to get to whatever her name is. Um, it's a metaphorical archetypal story. The reason at the end of Snow White, the last shot is a paradise. They ride off into the sunset, and the camera pans up to paradise, and it gets a bad rap. People say, "Oh, Disney films are ruined people's expectations of relationships," and that's not what those scenes are trying to depict. What they're trying to depict is that the union of the masculine and the feminine is what leads to paradise, or is possibly what leads you to paradise. And that's true both socially, and it's true both individually. So when you say men and women need to stop fighting each other, you're completely spot on, because I think that might be a good way of judging the well-being of society, is to what degree the men and women are uh, cooperative with one another.
I agree. I agree with everything you just said. That's kind of my hope. My hope is that the new paradigm is that, like, yes, these two parts can make a third thing, and that third thing is very important.